This is a course called Globalization since 1492. We've got a really distinguished group this evening, and our focus tonight is 9/11. We came up with the title 9/11 in the Global Community. This is a course on globalization studies. 9/11 is obviously having a huge effect. A certain interpretation of 9/11 gives justification to the war on terror. It's resulted in invasions, a big invasion of Iraq, a NATO invasion of Afghanistan. We've seen major legislative changes in Canada, in the United States, of course, where the Patriot Act was passed. Major things have been done in terms of limiting civil liberties in the name of the war on terror. Major geopolitical transformations have taken place through the disposition of armed forces, especially in the Middle East, in the oil-rich areas. So this particular interpretation that we've been given of 9/11, that it was basically caused by Islamic fundamentalists with very extreme views who hate the West and hijacked planes in order to crash them into buildings and take revenge. It was said by the President of the United States that the reason for it is because they hate our freedoms. And some of us have been questioning that explanation. We're far from alone. It's a huge topic on the internet. So this is the framework. This establishes some of the underlying assumptions for what brings us here tonight. One very important theme was that the war on terror and the resulting commitment that we've been asked to make as governments, as peoples, mobilized in society towards the objective of fighting wars. This is occurring at a time, a crucial time in the history of humanity when we're facing a range of ecological, environmental crises on a scale that humanity hasn't dealt with before. But the topic that seemed to really catch our attention and arouse a lot of discussion and that we thought would be a good opening topic is the reality, the hard reality that discussing, investigating, talking about 9/11, especially in public venues, especially in university classes, for instance, including it in the curriculum, there does, I think I can go beyond saying, there is enormous taboos about this subject. It's made to seem that even addressing this subject and asking penetrating questions about this subject is a kind of taboo. So I think Professor Keefer, I'll ask you to lead off a discussion on 9/11 and taboos, and from there we might consider talking about specific institutions that I think have been in a way undermined, and I have in mind the academy, the journalistic community, especially the commercial media. What is it about this subject that has so many taboos attached, that even to raise the subject in a public way, even to put it on the table in a kind of official way, seems to be threatening and menacing, and sometimes harsh consequences arise from raising this topic?
Well, thanks, Tom. In speaking to that issue, I can't avoid mentioning the institutional framework, the institutions we all work in. And I'm reminded, when thinking about matters of this kind, of a really penetrating statement made in the early 1980s by a very distinguished American psychologist, Robert J. Lifton. He was the first person to have the idea that it might make sense to learn something about nuclear war by talking to the survivors of the nuclear attacks in Japan. That was in about 1960, 15 years after the event. And in the 1980s, his further reflections on the subject of nuclear war and the fact that it wasn't getting touched upon within universities led him to formulate what some other scholars have perhaps jocularly referred to as Lifton's Law. Lifton's Law being that there is an inverse correlation between the crucial importance of any given subject to human survival on this planet and the likelihood of its receiving serious study in universities. That's perhaps a cynical formulation, but and a slightly alarming one, but it does tell us that certain kinds of topics seem to be fairly systematically excluded from serious consideration in university. And 9/11 and the evidence relating to 9/11 is clearly one of those topics. The key reason for it being taboo, though, I think is more obviously a political one. That this evidence has the potential to completely delegitimize the government responsible for the events of 9/11. If, as we believe, as I believe very firmly, the evidence points unambiguously to the responsibility of the Bush government, or elements within the Bush government, for these events. To delegitimize the government, not merely in the eyes of people who might already disapprove of George Bush and his subordinates, but of people who recognize, with no doubt a degree of nausea, that their own government has failed in its most basic contract to the people it governs, namely to preserve their well-being and their lives. If you have a government that has, for reasons of global geopolitics, its desire to engage in resource wars and so on, and these are issues that I think we'll get into later, organized an event which has led to the deaths of a large number of people, then the most basic legitimacy of that government is put into question, not just for opponents of the party in power, but for people who have been longtime servants of the American state. Military officers, intelligence officers, government officials of all kinds.
First of all, I think it's clear that there is a taboo. I mean, I know 2 people who've lost their jobs because of their insistence in talking about this. I know a 3rd who's a young academic who's worried he might lose his job if he talks about it, so he's going to be quiet, probably. I don't have to worry about that particular issue because I took early retirement a few years ago, but there are certainly repercussions. So I don't think we need to quibble that it is taboo, because it is in many ways. Now the question then is, well, there's a bunch of questions. First of all, how do I personally feel that? How do I sense when a topic is taboo? It's interesting that Michael talked about if issues are life and death for humanity, there's a good chance they won't be dealt with in the university. I have found that consistently to be the case for 30 years in the university. When we were headed into what might have been a global nuclear war, at several times, but I'm thinking now the early 80s, our university didn't have a single course on it. Students didn't even know what the hell a nuclear weapon was. And so that's when we began introducing a few courses, and that's why we created this thing called Peace Studies. There was definitely a massive taboo about thinking about that and confronting it. Oh dear, people might get emotional in class. Well, they did. I had students weeping. So what? It's worth getting emotional about it. If you don't get emotional about global annihilation, which is, by the way, the term the United States Security Council document used to describe this. The only deterrent we can offer to the Soviet Union is to prepare for possible act of global annihilation.